I'm Stephen Foskett, organizer of Tech Field Day and publisher of Gestalt IT, and this is a Tech Field Day roundtable discussion live from Santa Clara, California, where we are at Tech Field Day 26. We were talking this morning about the future of VMware. We were talking about the future of the data center, and these discussions naturally come to another interesting point, which is that a lot of technology changes, specific technology changes, are coming. And many of those are driven not by traditional enterprise IT use cases, but by hyperscale use cases. This week, we're here in San Jose with the OCP Summit, the Open Compute Project, which really is, I think, the gold standard of taking technology from the hyperscale space and bringing it into the rest of the world. We have OCP standards for almost every part of the server. We've got a completely different server design. We've got compatible componentized motherboards. We're also going to be doing the CXL forum this week at OCP Summit. In fact, we're going to spend all of Thursday of Tech Field Day focusing on CXL technology. And we've just launched a new podcast called Utilizing CXL in podcast feeds near you, where you can learn a little bit more about how CXL is, what it is, how it's being used, and so on. But the unifying thread here is that a lot of technology development is being driven by the hyperscalers and is coming down into the enterprise now. Now, that hasn't always been the case. In fact, I've been a proponent of the argument that says, basically, you're not Facebook, when companies wanted to implement a lot of this kind of next generation's hardware, software, strategy, architecture. Yeah, that's great. You're not Facebook. That's not going to work for you. Well, maybe now, I don't want to say you are Facebook, but you are maybe more able to implement some of these things. We'll see. So let's kick off this discussion. Joey?
Yeah, and Stephen makes a great point. The last time I had a real job, as I like to say. I worked for Comcast Cable, and I was the principal architect. And this is 10 or 12 years ago now. And we were in the process of building our own private cloud. So we were really interested, and we were closer to Facebook than not Facebook, I guess I would say. At the time, we had 3 or 4 data centers throughout the U.S. And some of my colleagues went to this OCP Summit that we're at this week. And one of the things we couldn't do, but we kind of wanted to do, is implement some of the hardware standards. We used commodity off-the-shelf hardware from HP and Dell mostly, storage from EMC and a number of other vendors. And that stuff, as you can imagine, even at the scale we were buying it, was pretty expensive. But at the time, for us to switch to the kind of hardware Facebook, Microsoft, AWS was using, we would have had to have basically ripped and replaced our entire data center footprint to make it compatible with the new structure of like the actual width of the server racks we were talking about, much less the networking infrastructure and cabling. I think now things have changed and evolved long enough. And I think with data centers being slightly smaller and easier, it becomes a little bit more easier for regular, as I like to call them, regular companies to adopt some of these standards. And I'm curious as to what everybody else in the room and online is thinking about that.
Well, I don't think that most of enterprises will adopt these standards in terms of rack and density, but it is going to change. And also, thanks for CXL. So we already talked about the fact that we are moving a lot of stuff from the data center to the cloud. So many companies are going to rethink how they design their data centers, how they design their infrastructure. And especially if we look at Europe, for example, energy efficiency is paramount at this point. So you are thinking about maximum efficiency, maximum flexibility, things that were not the case a few years ago. So this brings you closer to the way the Googles and the Facebooks of this world think about their data center. Even if we are talking about a smaller, shrinking data center, you want much more efficiency. So the shift to SSDs, for example, is one, but actually composability that is, coming next. It will help us to have, much more efficient infrastructure, and you can buy the components that you need when you need them, and not, standardize on, standard servers, for example, and then try to use VMware on top or any other abstraction layer to get what you need. So a lot of things are going to change in the next 2-3 years, and when it comes to investments and architectures, yes, it will be much more designed in a way that resembles the hyperscaler even if we are not using the same component or the same, racks or whatever.
And beyond Joey's point about, having to rip and replace everything for this new standard, I think it comes down to whether it's a DIY type solution versus an enterprise supportable solution. But what I mean is that something that has like a prescribed architecture and support structure. That's what you're probably going to be looking for in an enterprise data center. And bringing the composability into the data center is going to depend on the vendors basically offering you some kind of architecture that they're going to stand behind and support over the term of the existence of that, right?
Well, consider that all this as a service model that many vendors are proposing now, like HP, GreenLake, and things like that. I mean, Apex from there are similar. So you will buy whatever you need at that moment in time, and then you will be able to expand or maybe shrink the infrastructure in a cloud fashion much more than today. So it will become easier to think in a cloud way, even for your data center, while keeping an eye on efficiency and
that's vendors having to pivot. If we look at the hyperscalers and the likes of OCP, they're using that open compute platform. They're not buying Dell, they're not buying HPE. So if customers are moving to the cloud, vendors have to try and regain some of that market share back. And that's why they're offering these cloud operating models, the likes of Apex, GreenLake, etc., that you've said there. So they're having to pivot to try and keep their share. But it's giving customers and consumers fantastic options. You can go pure deep into your chosen cloud provider, or you can go somewhere in between with the likes of the hyperscalers. You're obviously, the more you pay, the more convenience you have, the more you're offloading. Pizza as a service. Do you want the whole pizza or do you want the oven? They're having to pivot.
I like this.
Man, you killed us. You slay us with your metaphor.
Yeah.
So let's talk about some specifics. Lightning round. Which technologies come from Twitter, Meta, Facebook, Microsoft, Google, etc., that are absolutely impacting enterprise tech now?
I'll say it for
You can see one.
Kubernetes.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, we heard of Kubernetes over here. Yes, there we go. And by the way, we talked about that in detail in a roundtable discussion at Cloud Field Day a couple weeks ago. So look for the, what is Kubernetes
Fill a
mean for
bingo
enterprise
card.
tech?
Fill a bingo card. What else?
So what else?
You saw it just a few months ago when VMware introduced DPUs in their servers. That was already existing in the hyperscalers through like Nitro and AWS. Putting manageability in some kind of out-of-band management card and bringing services like storage and networking via that instead of like jamming it into the hypervisor or whatever, bringing manageability to other kinds of workloads that wasn't previously there. So we're starting to see that emerge as a use case as well. And, depending on what happens to VMware in the future, it could be the next big thing in the data center. And that would mirror some of the hyperscaler capabilities.
Next one, object storage, S3, the accidental protocol.
Yeah. I think the API-ification of everything. I mean, S3 is an example of that, but I think
API-ification.
Well, yeah. I mean, being able to deploy anything from a single, shell script or PowerShell or API call.
Infrastructure as code.
Yeah. Infrastructure as code is totally a result of the cloud driving that. Like that's really where that came from. The other one I want to throw in there, even though I think it's like loosely affiliated, is OAuth for authentication and authorization. And I know OAuth isn't authorization, but like cloud security coming in everywhere.
It's easier model.
Honestly, also Ethernet for everything. I mean, if you think about traditional enterprise, fiber channel was mandatory. Was the enterprise transport for your storage, but now it's not anymore. This comes from service providers in general. The fact that you are converging everything on a single cable.
Yeah, that's great.
We'll bring in InfiniBand. Ethernet is consistently 5 years behind InfiniBand in terms of latency.
I think you've just proved Enrico's point. Yes, Ethernet for everything. Yeah.
Well, how many of you worked with customers now have the concept in their own data centers of availability zones? Like the hyperscalers, right? Who have huge buildings that are next to each other in the same region, and some of my customers might be putting workloads across their campus, or even within their data center, they're going like this row is an availability zone and it's powered off of a different breaker than that one, or something along those lines. Those are some of the hyperscaler principles that I've seen come into enterprise data centers.
They have to be manually modeled though for most. If it's outside of a cloud provider, it's manually thought of.
True. More of the DIY that
you can kind of do it in VMware.
Portables has baked in AZ level functionality quite well.
But then we're talking about making it application level awareness instead of infrastructure in terms of how you handle failure.
Well, but even in the cloud solutions, right? Availability zones and availability sets require, like, they're an infrastructure component, but if you don't have a application component, they don't buy you anything.
Right.
Well, definitely, you talk about availability zone and understanding the impact that has to a data center and how they can do it that as a best practice to increase their availability. That's something they can do. In the past, most data centers are just like, oh, that data center is down, nothing you can do about it. But having the granularity to have that discussion and say, oh, let's break it up, let's make it more available without having a separate DR strategy, but just increasing the resilience of a single data center.
There are a lot of large organizations that operate at DC level failover. You know, Twitter or a DC as its own.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, actually, don't forget that, banks and many other institutions had multiple data centers already in the 70s, and they had, mainframes, two mainframes. One was primary, one secondary, and business continuity was already there. Implemented at the hardware level, maybe.
And there's still one.
Yeah.
So let's more technologies.
S3.
How about the whole hyperconvergence, the whole concept of no specialized boxes? Everything is standardized, everything is distributed, everything is sharded. That's a real hyperscale approach to doing things, isn't it?
Posability?
Yeah.
Isn't it? I'm not sure. I mean, if you look at the large hyperscale data center, you see that they have huge pool of resources that they use a little bit differently than a hyperconverged architecture.
Yeah, they have different SKUs for different services. Like
Yeah.
the hardware deployments aren't the same for all the services.
No, I consider that in most cases, hyperscalers don't think about the data center like an enterprise. So they'll just let things die.
Yeah.
So, and they don't care.
Well, that's a great point. Though let's start off the next thing, which is kind of what hyperscale things aren't necessarily hitting the enterprise, and that's a good one right there. Let it die.
Yeah, but and we could do it. I mean, so we mentioned object storage multiple times. So you have multiple safeties in an object storage infrastructure, and you can let really things die. But when you talk with an enterprise customer and say, like, buy 2 servers more and don't buy any support contract. What do you care about hardware? You can keep adding servers, and when they die, you can wait 2-3 days, even a month to replace an hard drive. And you look at their faces, they say, no, we want 4-hour intervention because, you never know. Well, actually, you can have 60% of your server die before having any problem with your data. Why are you spending additional money? Because this is our standard process.
Yeah, and that's really alien for enterprise tech. That's kind of a concept that they just wouldn't do. They just wouldn't let it sit there.
Red lights are bad.
So what other things are not hitting the enterprise?
So far, ARM, it's starting to proliferate in the hyperscalers. And there's predictions that it's going to take over the data center, but I haven't seen it yet. Maybe that will come with the next generation of applications, but so far, not so good for ARM in the data center.
When Windows Server really supports ARM, it will take over. I don't know when that's going to happen, nor can I speculate.
They're making a big push on green. The fact that generally ARM architecture uses less power, it's more power efficient. They're making a big push there. Ampere are certainly trying to give us processors that we would use at data center scale. But it's a complete refactoring of everything we do on x86 or x64, moving it over to ARM. It's a lot of work and time and investment.
I will say from a Microsoft perspective, they did a lot of work. Like the way they made SQL Server work on Linux is really kind of technically cool, and it should be more feasible to make Windows work in an ARM platform because of some of the work that's already been done. But I think ultimately what's going to drive that is Microsoft's power savings in Azure.
Yeah, and another thing that maybe comes from the enterprise and now landed in the hyperscaler space and is developed there, and can go back to enterprise is the hard drive. I mean, the latest generation of hard drives, multiple heads, multiple controllers, they are really tough to manage in an enterprise environment, and most of the development is made there because big hardware manufacturers are selling hard drives only to hyperscalers, so they are optimizing these devices for them. But you can't use these devices in a traditional array. You can't use. I mean, you need to write specific software. You have to control everything end to end, and this is not something that enterprise can do. And more hardware is designed in that way.
Mm-hmm.
But we have new storage companies though that are leveraging these new form factors. With hundreds of layers in a NAND device now. The storage technology is advanced well, and now we're getting new software options to wrap that and turn it into something usable. As a filer or a block storage device or object. The objectification of everything at the minute.
Objectification? I don't think that word means what you think it means, but no, I know you're making fun.
Yeah.
But that's that. Yeah, there you go.
HTML interface.
That's not hitting the enterprise?
No, I'm saying that it is in it.
Oh, okay. I was like, man, I'm out.
The need for that has been, exponentially. Remember, if you're an old school VMware admin, the nightmare before that, we talked about the keystone of VMware in the environment. Now they've switched to HTML5. Have they done a great job? No, not 100%, but it is HTML5. And that HTML5,
ubiquitous. Very slow to move to HTML5. There's so many different silos of applications, and bringing them under that single umbrella is a mountain of work, and it takes a lot.
Yeah, but HTML5 is a lot better options than you had in the past. I mean, it's more flexible. So I think that's a big thing that the hyperscalers have done.
Well, I've got another kind of maybe a controversial one, but more than 2-socket servers. Multi-socket servers are really being designed only for the cloud, for hyperscalers. And to the extent that Intel had an entire 3rd-generation Xeon product that was basically the Facebook CPU, not the rest of us CPU, and is completely different from Ice Lake. And so I would say that increasingly 4 and 8-socket CPUs are cloud CPUs, not enterprise CPUs.
I haven't seen a lot of 4 or 8-socket CPU demand in the enterprise. Right?
Exactly. And that's the point.
Very few enterprise applications. It's like SAP HANA is a big one, right?
Yeah, it's
HANA's black.
HANA and database servers, and
basically,
and those are. It's rare that we see those in database land anymore.
Could be a Superdome or whatever, but they're very, very siloed use cases for those.
Because if we're trying to commoditize the data center, we want to reduce the failure domain so that we don't have to carry as much about the hardware. We're going to care a lot more about a 4 or 8-socket CPU server being unavailable all of a sudden than our 1 or 2 sockets.
Well, and for the most part, well, I shouldn't say that. At least in database workloads, the demands for 4 and 8-socket servers were driven by the increased amount of RAM you could get in them. Mm-hmm. And now that you can get massive amounts of RAM in a 2-socket server, usually the processing needs aren't there, but the RAM is.
Well, and let me ask you again, as our resident database guy, NoSQL, is that making a huge impact in the enterprise?
Not a huge impact, but it's used. I think one of the things that where NoSQL comes in, and this is kind of a side effect of cloud, since you can deploy things as a service, it's a lot easier to deploy multiple data stores for different applications, right? So, or different even tiers of applications. So if you want to use a NoSQL store for logging or to have a graph inference in your application, you can, but at the same time, you don't necessarily have to stand up a whole separate set of infrastructure for it. You can just consume that as a service. And naturally where that change has come in.
I think 10, 12 years ago, I was using more quad socket servers, vSphere 4 or 4.1 than any time recently. But that was more, back then it was, you could only really scale up, and quad socket was an advent of that. But since then, the industry pivoted to scale out being a better approach.
Yeah.
Higher levels of availability. So I don't think I've architected anything recently. Quad sockets.
Plus, the density of cores versus the density that you got from sockets just made it kind of not useful or valuable, especially in the case of a failure.
And it's a much bigger fault domain.
Right.
What?
For sure.
CPUs aren't hot swappable?
Well,
Bring back Sun.
Maybe.
Let me tell you about the performance impact of hot swappable CPU and vSphere on database workloads.
it works fine. No issues.
As long as you like your database to be 30% slower, sure.
I thought you were going to say 30% complete. Well, so, okay, one more question then, maybe to take us home here on technologies from hyperscalers. What technologies from hyperscalers do you think will have a big impact soon? OCP NICs. I will just say that right now. A lot of next generation servers are have OCP slots for network interface cards. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with these, but it's having it's coming. It's going to be here. Another very specific server technology that is vanishing is SATA DOM. And again, you're like, wait, what? Yeah, if you don't know what this is, that's how the server boots. Well, guess what? Those ports are gone in next generation servers. And I think that that's because hyperscalers don't want them. And enterprises might be, especially ESX people, might be saying, wait a second. Yeah. So that's, rulers and small form factor SSDs are coming. And, is that a hyperscale technology? I don't know. And then, of course, we keep talking, we're talking about CXL a lot. I think that may have a big impact on the enterprise. Do you agree with me on those, or what other technologies do you want to jump in with?
Well, CXL will have a huge impact anyway. I mean, not just in the traditional data center, but I start thinking that it will have an impact also at the edge. So it really depends on how it will be implemented. But actually, if they will be able to implement CXL at every level with very small devices, then you will have these composable micro infrastructures at the edge that will be much more serviceable than today. So potentially, we'll see more and more, flexible infrastructure. That is something that we don't have today.
I think OCP is interesting. You're either architecting your servers around the OCP framework or you aren't. The good thing, I think, is both sides are invested in CXL. 200 plus companies have all signed up and agreed they're going to do things this way. I think at the moment it's too large to fail. There's too many big players on board, and I think it'll go that way. And the operational efficiencies, as with every technology, we've had, virtualization, Kubernetes, it's hyperscalers, large enterprise, mid-size, small business. It'll be a long time before SMBs are using CXL, leveraging, but there'll be a lot of mid-sectors will be using it within 5-6 years. Okay, is that fair? Probably. Nobody wants to commit.
Well, as the host of the podcast, along with you, I'm going to say that, I think that we're going to see it come in waves.
Yeah.
But I definitely think it's going to have an impact. Yeah. What other technologies are soon?
Will come from?
Yeah.
Well, NVMe is something that has to be talked about, right? I mean, that's the direction that everyone has gone to from major storage providers in the past 3 to 4 years. It used to be just, niche, it's super fast, it's super cool. But now they can scale it a little bit better and then make it available. So it's like, it used to be, oh my God, I got to develop a RAID. I got to do a LUN. I got to figure out storage groups. NVMe solves that.
Well, in the same way, CXL, NVMe over Fabric more than NVMe.
Exactly. So now that the delivery bus is better with CXL for NVMe, it's going to change the equation of how to consume that resource at scale.
The one thing I'm always curious to see is management. And the one thing that I think that hasn't happened from the hyperscaler down to the data center perspective in a way that is convincing to very many customers is the literal tools provided by the cloud providers like Azure Stack or what is AWS Outpost. I suspect that that's a growth opportunity for both of those companies to literally bring the hyperscaler data center into your four walls in a way that you can literally say every single service is available in our new region, which is called home base or whatever.
Don't get cloud-like, get cloud.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Also on the manageability front, the equivalent of the API to the whatever's in the GUI, right? That exists in the hyperscalers. Doesn't necessarily exist in your data center today. There's a few culprits of that, right? And you would hope that would come to the enterprise data center. I would like to see that happen. Also, I don't know, much like you were saying, Can we expect that in the next 5 to 6 years? Fingers crossed.
I'm starting to hear that more, though, from companies. They'll say, everything you see here is available in the API. Like, we've had some companies specifically say that at Field Day, and every time it warms my heart when I hear that.
Yeah.
It does, and you see that more with the new products. With the long-term established legacy products, they say, oh, our APIs are getting better, but they haven't said they're equivalent to our interface yet.
I think we should also think about what, can't happen in the next few years. I mean, so we are talking about all these new technology, how they will impact the data center, but actually there are some legacy applications that don't really think about, sharing resources across servers or things like that. If you have a, 20, 40 years old application that is still at the core of your company, you're going to keep that application running in the same way.
I think initially it'll be abstracted, but it'll develop into something that leverages the capability.
Abstracted development, I mean, so if it was true, I mean, think about mainframes. So some banks have mainframe installed in the 70s. This is the same application.
I saw something like, or somebody shared this with me last week about how it must have been at the conference I was at, where some consortium of banks was spending like $8 million a year on mainframe parts from eBay.
Oh my God.
Well, yeah, I got some crazy stories about that in financial too. The stack of PC AT computers, where you just, if this one dies, you just throw it out and get the next one in the stack so that you can continue to run that old application.
That's high availability.
Yep.
It's kind of interesting to hear you all talk about what's coming to the data center or what is coming from the hyperscalers. The thing is that a hyperscaler thinks totally different than any other company, right? So there will be things that come into the data center, definitely. But there's also things that won't ever come to the data center just because the scale and everything that a hyperscaler thinks about is just not going to happen in a data center that's in an enterprise or even with the SME. So it's interesting to hear all the things that are coming over, but there's definitely going to be a lot of stuff that will be with the hyperscalers and not in the data center of an enterprise.
Well, because there's no justification. I mean, there's no use case, right? It's too complex, too big.
And to Steven's point, you're not Facebook. Like, there's no benefit to you doing some of this crap, even if you can.
That's a pretty meta conversation.
Yeah, but it's true. I think that and we said this in the first roundtable about VMware. We said this in the second one, and Melissa brought it up. It is all about what is the use case, what is the point, what are we getting from this? It's a practical decision, right? If we're ready for it, we can adopt technologies, and if we're not, well, we won't, no matter how much the companies want to push it, right?
And we shouldn't.
Thank you very much for joining us for this discussion on hyperscale tech in the enterprise data center from Tech Field Day 26. You can find videos like this at our Tech Field Day website. This is, again, Tech Field Day 26. You can also go to YouTube/Tech Field Day and click on the Roundtable playlist, and you'll see more Roundtable discussions like this one, where it's just us delegates talking about technology. No presentations, no demos, no nothing. And these presentations tend to be pretty popular. So we're going to be recording another one next, and we've recorded a couple this morning. So if you enjoyed this, please do go and look and see those other ones too.